Okay, how's everybody doing? Sorry for the delay here. For those of you watching on the live Zoom, or maybe more importantly on the recorder, when we had some issues with trying to get Zoom set up, so we had to have the tech run over from a different building to do that. So it just seems like every now and then we do have an issue that nobody's ever seen before, and requires one of our tech guys to fix it. So he had to come over and install a new version. So anyway, so it's about 10 till 2, so we've lost about 20 minutes. Not a big deal. I mean, we'll just we'll make do. We're resilient. We'll figure this out. So I'm going to cover the rest of chapter 5 today, and talk about some things which are, well, a couple of other elasticity measures I'll get to before we leave, and then also some applications to elasticity. Primarily, I'm going to start with the issue of tax incidence as it relates to the price elasticity of demand. And I hope before we leave, this is my plan at least, was to get into chapter 6, which deals with utility. Clearly, we'll be able to get into that on Wednesday and maybe even into next week as well. And then, so this is really the schedule, which is not too different than what we had planned on the syllabus. But we'll try to stay on track as much as we're able to. Okay. So, anybody in the room have any questions for me, or anybody on the Zoom call have any questions that I can answer for you before we get started here? Okay, I want to just back up, and if you do, that's fine. You can just hit me up here in a second. I want to get back to this idea of price elasticity of demand, just as some really quick review. Okay, real quick review, and that is, what is price elasticity? Now, it's a pretty important concept because it sort of takes this idea of a downward sloping demand curve, which up to this point we sort of presented as 45 degrees down, which sort of suggests that all demand curves are the same. And so we're going to sort of modify that, which is what we began doing last week by saying all demand curves are not the same. And that is, they have different slopes. And so if demand is what we call price elastic, the slope would be very flat, and meaning that there's a lot of sensitivity on the part of the buyer. The buyer can pick or choose whether or not he chooses that good or another good based upon the criteria such as we talked about availability of substitutes, the percentage of the goods price in relation to buyers' incomes, etc. And by the way, in that final one here, if we got into this on Wednesday or not, but the goods that are very inexpensive can have lots of price fluctuation. They can even double in price, and we may not even notice it, or we may not even care. This is why when you see goods that are very low price, but also very very low elasticity, that you see these goods at the checkout areas of stores right as you leave, things like candy bars and shot glasses and keychains. And the price of keychain went from 75 cents to $1.50. It's a huge increase in price, percentage-wise, 100% increase, and people still buy it, and that's why they're going to put them there. It's because people have low sensitivity, low elasticity. And also things like candy bars, are strategically placed so that little hands can grab them on the way. I don't know if anybody has any little hands that they take to the grocery stores, but that's part of the logic of that, is to make you insensitive to the price. So if it's very flat, it's a price elastic demand curve. It's very steep, it's an inelastic demand curve. And I guess more than the 45-degree down that we first started talking about, just as a sort of a conceptual idea, is what we call unit elastic, which, and again, when I talked last time about this idea of elasticity, and where I said that I think, my instincts tell me that if I pulled somebody off the street and said, if the price of some good goes up by 20%, what would happen to the quantity demanded? I think most people would say it would fall by 20%. In other words, I think most people would be not really conscious of this idea of sensitivity, even though in their own lives they are conscious of it, because of the fact that they'll say, well, I've got to pay $5 for gasoline, or $4 for gasoline, or I've got the rent's gone up, I've got to pay it. What choice do I have? That sort of thing. So inelasticity is oftentimes recognized, and maybe sometimes elasticity too. I'm not paying the price of that good because what? Because fill in the blank, that sort of thing. So those are some of the reasons that exist. One final thing that I want to talk about with regard to elasticity, and it's basically this. And I know that sometimes people get confused on this, and it's easy to get confused. And that is, what exactly is elasticity? And moreover, what can we do with it? I'm having some real trouble with the camera here, so kind of bear with me a second. So I'm just going to come back here to the board. I'm going to go over here. And what is elasticity? In other words, what is this number? Now remember, on Wednesday, we did a couple of calculations, and I think we had one that came out at exactly 1 and the other at 1.67. And what do we say that 1.67 was? We said it's price elastic. It's above 1. But what does that number mean? So what is elasticity? In other words, what is the value of elasticity? What can we do with it? Well, so think about this. First of all, what is it and what is it not? And it's probably, this is one of those definitions that's probably best described by saying what it's not, okay? So what it's not is, it's not a percentage. And this is often very misleading, particularly because when we have something like 1.67 or maybe it's very inelastic, we have 0.25. I mean, I think we're all sort of conditioned and rightly so to think, okay, well, 0.25, that must mean that that's 25%. Well, it's not 25% because what's it 25% of? There's no of part of this that makes sense. So elasticity is not a percentage. So maybe I should say elasticity is not percentage. It's also not a dollar figure, okay? And sometimes people make this mistake and put a dollar figure on it. It's not a dollar figure. There's no connection to dollar figures at all. Even though we use dollars in the price part of the calculation, it's not a dollar figure. So it's not a percentage, it's not a dollar figure. It is, however, a ratio. And that's really all it is. All elasticity measures are ratios. And all they're simply measuring is the percentage change in one thing and the percentage change in another. And that's all it is. Now, with ratios, we can do a lot of things with them. We can, in fact, plug these ratios in to formulas to see what the effect is going to be. For instance, the price change. Excuse me. So we're going to get toward the very end of this chapter today. We're going to talk about what this means. And one of the things that I alluded to on Wednesday was the idea that it sounds like price elasticity of demand is just a demand side concept only. All it relates to is demand. However, as I have said before, and it's really something I think is worth sort of keeping in your mind, is that what it really also means is the idea that the supply side really has to understand what the demand side is up to so that appropriate pricing decisions can be made. And here, I think we want to take a bit of a divergence from some of maybe the introduction to business classes you've taken, or maybe even some introductory accounting courses in which sort of a presentation of a good is made. Okay, it cost us $1.50 to make a widget, and so we're going to mark it up to $2, and it's going to be a standard markup and all that. And it sort of suggests that there's this sort of standard markup to the prices of goods, when in fact, this difference between price and cost, which we're going to get into a lot really very soon, can be wide, it can be thin. There are some goods that there's not much difference at all between the price of the good, which is the exchange value of the good, and the cost of the good, which is the cost for the producer to bring it. Okay. Sometimes it's razor thin. So you might think, well, why does anybody want that? It's because they flip over tremendous amounts of volume, so that's good. Other times that margin is really, really wide. You know, things like, and there are some goods that have extremely high margins. We're going to get into, I'll give you some examples of those. Things like jewelry and luxury goods and things like cosmetics are very large margins. Pharmaceutical drugs, really, really fat margins. That is, the price that's charged over the cost of production is tremendous. Sometimes a markup of hundreds of percent. So it's important to know there is no standard markup. There is no really rule of thumb. And what this means is that business firms, to the extent that they can, are going to do what I think a lot of us suspected they were doing anyway, and that is they're going to charge whatever they can get away with. In other words, that whole statement about whatever the freight can bear. So how does this elasticity as a ratio work? Well, it's going to impact the pricing decision, which we're going to get into and show why this is significant. Okay, let's talk about one, and this is talked about in your book, and I'm not going to get into the graphs of this because I think it's probably a little bit, we can really get off into some tall weeds. I know some textbooks get into the issue of tax incidence and really get off into the hinterlands. And I think that's probably not what we want to do here, but instead just talk about what it is, okay? And one of the very last things I left you with on Wednesday was the idea that not just this idea that who cares about the price of the good. It sounds like it's a demand side concept only. Okay, so in the circular flow model, okay, it's the household. If it's a consumer good, it's the household. But keep in mind, firms are also buyers of goods. The entire B2B realm of goods, buying goods from other firms. You know, no individuals really buy 18-wheelers and cranes and conveyor belts. It's a business-to-business transaction. So firms are also part of the demand side. but also the supply side, as I just mentioned, is interesting. So there's one other part of the circular flow model, that's government. So government fits in, particularly in terms of a good can be taxed, okay, to the extent that a good is taxed. And this brings us to this topic of what's called tax incidence. Tax incidence is essentially this, the definition that I gave, and this is about, we're still in this is the week 4 PowerPoint package. All right, so the degree in which a goods tax is paid by either the buyer alone, the seller alone, or some combination of both the buyer and seller. Okay, let's talk about this because I know that this sort of violates, particularly those who've had introductory accounting, this sort of violates people's conception of who pays the tax. And I've seen this again and again where students say, wait a minute, what are you talking about? The seller paying the tax? The seller never pays the tax. If it's a sales tax, when does the seller ever pay the sales tax? And we're going to talk about how the seller can pay the sales tax, okay? Because I know that the accounting transaction is, okay, the good sells for $500, and if the sales tax is 6%, then it's $30 taxed on above it, so it's $530 is the price the buyer pays, right? We kind of get that. But what if that buyer is very sensitive to the price of the good and doesn't want to pay that tax? Because just that tax alone makes it a buy or don't buy decision. Can the seller then pay the tax? And the answer is yes. Sometimes the seller can pay the entirety of the tax. By doing what? By lowering the price of the good and absorbing that. Because it doesn't really matter. The government doesn't really care who pays the tax as long as someone pays the tax. Now, we should realize, of course, that goods taxes and services taxes, for that matter, are primarily levied by states and by cities. It's usually the state that collects it and forwards it back to the city or county or whatever locality. In some parts of the country, there are parishes and townships and whatnot. So remember, all local government is an extension of state government. So it's primarily a state government function when it comes to collecting sales taxes. Also, in some states, taxes are levied primarily on physical goods and not on services. And that's beginning to change as services are becoming more important in our economy. New Mexico, we tax services as well. You go to the doctor or dentist, you pay a tax on the, actually, I don't know if you pay a tax on go to the doctor or dentist, do you? I think medical doesn't necessarily apply, but if you go to get your haircut, for instance, right? That's a service and that would be taxed at the state level. It's a form of sales tax. That's all it is a form of sales tax. So if you think back, sometimes, and I know that we've all heard ads for furniture stores or appliance dealers saying, we'll pay your sales tax. And it sounds like a real come on, doesn't it? It sounds like, oh yeah, sure, you'll pay my sales tax. Well, in fact, they can pay your sales tax if they really want to sell the good. And I can remember during the last recession we had, again, around 2008, 2009, the furniture stores were really, nobody was buying furniture really, because everyone was sort of freaking out about the economy. And so I actually had to buy a piece of furniture because I needed to buy a couch and the price was really low. And they were like pretty much begging me, we'll deliver it to your house. Take upstairs, we'll do whatever, They just, I didn't get into this issue of, well, you pay my sales tax, but I guess maybe I should have, right? So you get the idea, but they did negotiate a price. And so that's sort of a way of doing that is by lowering the price, by absorbing it. And they can pay the entire tax, or they can divide it up. And so the buyer can pay some, seller can pay some, based upon this idea of the price elasticity of demand. So before we get into the breakdown of this, the types of goods taxes, we're talking about sales taxes, which is what we all know about, levied by the state, primarily on goods which are well, not primarily, always on goods that are subject to the tax. A lot of states, New Mexico included, doesn't tax things of food products. Certain healthcare products do not get taxed at the sales tax level. Okay, but we do tax services. So if you go to an accountant, you pay the sales tax. And so all that does, and we call it the gross receipts tax. Not all states have that. Some states rely very heavily on sales tax because they don't have an income tax. And we get in macro, even the whole issue of that. And I know that right now there's a big discussion, well, not a big discussion because it's not really going anywhere, but Congress is talking about a national sales tax to replace the income tax, which is, it sounds like maybe that's a great idea. It's a really terrible idea. Even people who are sponsoring it know it's never going to happen. I'm sure President Biden has zero interest in going with it, and I can't imagine any president wanting to do that. A national sales tax and do away with the income tax. I think that would cause chaos like you wouldn't believe. So it's primarily a state function. However, sometimes government gets involved in very certain goods, a very small subset of goods, and tax on some things they call excise taxes, which are sometimes a combination of state and federal, sometimes called sin taxes. So certain goods are just sort of targeted for tax, like what kind of goods in particular? Or they're just sort of putting their head above the water. Is that good?
Luxury goods?
Luxury, sometimes luxury goods. A luxury tax is sort of a sin tax, yeah. So cigarettes, alcoholic beverages, gasoline. Now, gasoline, there's nothing sinful about gasoline, although I guess that depends on who you ask. But you know, they're called. I put this in quotes because you know I'm not considering cigarettes a sin necessarily, but that's the term of art. You may, if you Google it, you'll probably see lots of references to sin taxes. It just sort of, it's a very old school term, but it still sort of pops up. These are certain goods that are targeted for taxation, and the reason why is because of the fact that buyers tend to be less sensitive to the price of the good. Therefore, they're natural targets of taxation. And there's a whole body of economic literature, that is academic literature, that talks about why government will target certain goods for taxation, particularly for add-on taxes. When the federal government might jump in, and cigarettes, the federal government has jumped in. And a lot of the price of a pack of cigarettes, as you probably know, is mostly tax. I mean, I don't know what cigarettes, what do cigarettes cost now? I haven't smoked it. $10? Okay, well, is it $10? My
brother pays almost 10.
I'm glad I don't smoke anymore. So, geez, it's $10 per pack of cigarettes.
Remember you want to buy the dollar?
Yeah, what's that?
Yeah, do you want to watch the dollar?
Well, I mean, yeah, unless you smoke, and then they're worth a lot more. Well, these are okay. So the economic literature on this says that there's a reason why individual consumers are targeted for certain taxes because they have no bargaining power with government, whereas firms do. And it's this whole idea that we as consumers don't band together and protest against a certain tax, but sellers of goods do. In fact, they not only do they protest certain taxes of goods, they will proactively try to prevent taxes of goods. There was a few years ago, I saw an ad where there was some discussion in Congress about trying to levy a tax on a special tax on things like Coke and Pepsi and all that. And it was basically a sugar tax because people were concerned primarily about obesity and the contribution of thanks to that. And the industry was out there with ads well before this thing was even a thing, saying, tell Congress not to tax your beverages. And it really wasn't even that big of a thing. They were that's how concerned they were to try to head that tax off. And that trade organization was out there. We've also seen the dairy industry do the same thing, out there trying to prevent proactively to try to prevent taxes. The supply side is considered to be much more cohesive as a political force than is the demand side when it comes to consumer goods. And so consumers have very little bargaining power. You can say, hey, I don't want to pay higher taxes on gasoline, but you know, good luck with that. And but oil companies can certainly say, we don't want the tax to come our way. And believe me, the oil companies, probably more than any other industry, have had success at influencing the tax code, whether it's income tax, excise taxes, whatever. If you ever look at the corporate tax code, page after page after page is devoted to special provisions for the oil industry. I realize it's a unique industry, it's got a lot of supply chain complexities and whatnot, but still you get the idea. I'll talk more about that in a second. So sin taxes, all these things which are special purpose are taxes, including special purpose taxes. Okay, special purpose taxes also are targeted toward consumers. These are taxes on particular goods like concert tickets, or if you go to Las Vegas, you pay a resort fee. Right, the resort fee is a tax. Which, by the way, for years the hotels were very slick about that. You know, they oftentimes wouldn't disclose that when you book a hotel room, and then you get there, it's $25 a night or $35 or whatever it is. The resort fee, and they wouldn't disclose that, and there's been a big pushback on that. It's a form of tax is what it is, and it goes to the local government. But the problem is if you've just flown in from New York and you know you just got there, and what are you going to do, turn around and go back, you know, because you don't want to pay the resort fee? What are you going to do? It's everywhere. You're going to stay somewhere. So that's a special purpose tax. I can remember when I was living in Indianapolis a few years ago. This was before Indy. This is a long time ago. Before Indy had a pro football team. That they decided to come up with a special purpose tax so that they could build a dome stadium. They built a dome indoor stadium, and they didn't even have a football team to put it in. So they had to go out and basically steal one from Baltimore, which is what they did. And then they said, okay, as soon as this is paid for, as soon as the bond issue is paid for, we'll take the tax away. There was a tax on hotels and restaurants in the downtown area. In other words, to try to tax other people who come in from out of town. And by the way, when the bond issue was paid for, the tax did not go away. So sometimes, politicians say one thing and mean another. And sometimes politicians inherit things from others who say, well, we didn't make that promise. That was the administration before us. That's not our problem. We would never have made that promise. Well, you can't go back and vote out somebody who's no longer in office, right? So special purpose taxes are those particular things. And then one particular thing, which I know it sounds like I've been on a rampage about for a long time, is lottery tickets. Lottery tickets are a form of tax. And whenever government gets involved in lottery, it's a way of taxing people. And the problem with lotteries is what do you think is, as an economist, and let's say you're an economist, and what would be the complaint that most economists have against lotteries in general?
Where it's supposed to.
Okay, maybe it's supposed to go one place and it doesn't. Okay, that could be one. Now let's think about on the demand side. Who buys lottery tickets primarily? Right? Yeah, lower income people tend to buy them, and people who have lesser understanding of what their odds are. Your odds are not particularly good at winning the big money, which is not say it doesn't happen. I know a guy who won $1 million in a lottery, and he did pretty well with it. I also know a guy who won $2 million in a lottery and went broke in 6 years. He was one of our customers. He was a bank customer of mine, and he did foolish things with his money. So it doesn't. If you want to ruin somebody's life, drop $1 million on them that they didn't expect to have, and it's kind of a crazy thing. And my boss, who I used to teach, he bought a house for for a big discount. I go, wow, did you buy a nice house, pool, and all that. And he said he bought it from a guy who had purchased it with his lottery, but then went broke and had to sell everything. And and in fact, the research is a lot of people who are not used to having that kind of money immediately have things like tax problems and things like that. So it's difficult. So I think it's caused a lot of problems. And I can tell you, I've been in line behind somebody at Circle K or whatever who will have won $5 or $10, and they often do what with that winnings? They turn into other tickets. It's like, oh my God. It's like, so and I know that a lot of people think, well, you're just against gambling. And it's like, well, maybe I'm a little bit, but should the government be involved in gambling? That's one of those normative questions. Since the word should is involved in it, it's one of those questions. And it's something that I know that we talk a bit about in our introduction to economics class, this idea, should government be involved in it? Because there are states, the state where I came from was against gambling in all forms. The only kind of gambling that was even legal was illegal. That was gambling in Catholic churches where I grew up in. That is every Friday and Saturday night there was bingo. They wouldn't dare break that up, but they were against every other form of gambling. And then they decided to come out the lottery, and then casino gambling and riverboat gambling and all this kind of thing. And so the question is, does it make sense? I know it sounds like I'm on a tear about this, but all I'm simply saying is that there are questions really about, does government need to be involved in certain parts of the supply chain, and taxes one. So I just realized the camera was not on that, so I apologize. And so I'll put that. So these are the form of taxes. This isn't your PowerPoint package.
But tariffs.
Tariffs are a form of tax on international trade. So, and the problem with tariffs is they oftentimes are passed along to buyers of goods. And so, yes, tariffs are, and tariffs, as much as a lot of countries talk about trying to bring down tariffs that are taxing goods that come across, particularly in their own country, a lot of countries, ourselves included, maintain tariffs on certain goods. And there's a tariff on sugar that's been there for years and years. And we just tax it because we can, and because there's, it also protects the domestic sugar industry to the extent that we don't produce enough sugar to meet our own consumption, so we have to bring it in mostly from Brazil. And so we have that. So special, I'm thinking primarily special purpose taxes about those taxes which primarily affect the demand side, particularly consumers. Tariffs actually do affect consumers, and so I know that a lot of people are against tariffs all the way for that particular reason. So what about tax incidence? And I sort of have alluded to this, but let's talk about what the main issue is, and it goes back to the topic of price elasticity demand. If the demand is relatively price elastic, then it's a flat demand curve, more of the tax will be paid by the seller. So any kind of a tax in which the buyer is very sensitive to the price, it tends to be paid by the seller. And this is particularly when you see that sellers have lots of bargaining power And this goes back to the example I gave with furniture, but it's also cases in which which car dealers aren't selling cars, and so they're marking cars down and we'll pay your sales tax and all that. This is when the power can shift to the buyer. If the buyer can walk away. If the buyer is able to walk away, they'll do it. However, the problem with this is most tax incidents, and in fact, the list I just gave you primarily falls on the demand side, where the demand side is relatively price inelastic. That is, it's insensitive to the price. It's a very steep demand curve, and more of the tax, if not all the tax, will be paid by the buyer. And it doesn't. And so there are certain taxes that just raise their hands looking to be taxed: alcoholic beverages, cigarettes, gasoline. And again, I know the term sin taxes is applied. All those, whether or not that you find it sinful or not. And I know I was standing behind a guy in line at Walgreens not too long ago, and he was buying a case of beer or whatever, and was talking to another guy. And he said, "What's that cost?" And he told him the price. He goes, "Wow." And he goes, "But it doesn't matter if the price doubled, I'd still buy the same amount of beer." It's like, wow. So, well, I guess that's, he's sold on buying beer. And I guess they know what they're doing when they tax certain things like alcohol. So you get the idea that the demand side really, because of the lack of bargaining power, is oftentimes forced to pay a higher tax, particularly as it's levied by state and local government. And the federal government will jump in on special goods taxes only certain goods like gasoline and cigarettes, and that's primarily it. The federal government does not really tax most goods at all. Okay. All right. So questions about tax incidence and what that's all about. Well, I want to move on to income elasticity. So this is our next measure. So in this chapter 5, I said that we're only going to really cover 3 elasticity measures, and they all really relate to the demand side. And I know that there is a price elasticity of supply, which basically is a very similar concept to price elasticity of demand, only it deals with the supply side. So you're free to read that, there's no problem. I just think it takes a lot of time, and it's mostly repetitious. And all we're really saying is that if the price elasticity of demand measures how responsive or sensitive the demand side is, and it's the same thing with the supply side. If the price goes up, do suppliers provide more output, and why? And there, the thing to know really, before we move on to these other 2, is that sometimes sellers can and cannot provide more output if the price goes up. So if you're an airline and people are just hanging on the door demanding more flights, you really can't. If you're totally booked up and all seats are taken, you can't provide more flights or more hotel rooms or more. So whatever you got, there's a technical and capacity limitation oftentimes with the price elasticity of supply. So that's all you really want to know from that. You can go ahead and read that on your own if you like, but I want to really focus on a couple of other topics related to demand side elasticity, and that's income elasticity. So remember, and I said on Wednesday that there are dozens and dozens of elasticity measures. It's not exactly a household term, elasticity, but economists use it a lot because it still measures how sensitive or how responsive is one variable to some change in some other variable. And here, we're still taking the same numerator, the change in supply and demand, but here we're saying, what is the change in buyers' incomes? And we use the algebraic symbol Y for income. This really comes out of macro, primarily the idea that Y mathematically is oftentimes considered to be a dependent variable. That is, it depends on things like, well, if it's a buyer, it might be hours worked or weeks worked, or however you want to measure people's incomes, or hourly wage, or your salesperson units sold, or whatever. So it's dependent. So think about Y as being income. That's the only reason why we sort of use that particular sort of methodology there. Okay, so that's what's going on with that. So what about income elasticity of demand? Without getting into the details, and by the way, the formula I gave you on price elasticity of demand, which was sort of it was a modification and an improvement, albeit a more complicated one. We call it the midpoint formula. It can apply to this as well. I think I have to look back in your text, but I think it does have the more expanded version where you have Q2 minus Q1 over, not Q1, but Q1 plus Q2 divided by Q2, that sort of thing. It is a very similar formula to what we used last time I gave you in class. All that does is say if you're going up, if price goes up, or in this case, if income goes up or income goes down, you'd have the same measure if you use that. But I give you this more simple formula because I don't know that you're going to be asked to provide any answers to this particular problem. What you're mostly going to have to understand here is what the relationship is between the quantity demanded In other words, the response of demand for a good, whatever the good in question is, to a change in income. And here we go back to this idea of normal goods versus inferior goods. And so even though I say that all the exams in this course are not comprehensive until we get to the final, a lot of these topics do build on each other. So you want to sort of, hit save in your mind on some of these. What about normal goods? What about inferior goods? We said, without giving the math and the sort of the explanation algebraically, that demand for normal goods tends to go in the same direction as income. Demand for inferior goods tends to be in opposite ways of income. And this is how we measure it. We use this idea of income elasticity. So if it's greater than 1, and here we don't take the absolute value, okay? We do not take the absolute value because we are very much interested in the sign of the variable here. Is it positive or is it negative or is it 0, for instance? Okay, whereas in price elasticity of demand, the ratio that we're just keying off of 1, and we know it's going to be negative anyway. We just get rid of that because we're only concerned about its relationship to 1. Here we're concerned about its relationship to 0. Is there any change at all? So if in fact the ratio, remember elasticity is a ratio, is greater than 1, that is the percentage change in quantity demanded, is more than proportional to the change in income, we say that it's a normal good, and included in that is luxury goods. Not that all luxury goods are normal goods, but luxury goods are a subset of all normal goods. And I realize that luxury goods are a small subset, but they are a subset of normal goods. They go in the same direction. And why you want to know this if you're a seller is you want to know what's happening with buyers' incomes. It might not be a great time to try to make a big promotion on selling Rolex watches and jewelry. If in fact the economy is doing poorly, and selling high-end products or travel or Disney World vacations or things like that, if people's incomes are not rising. Okay, so sometimes there are goods that demand sort of gets priced in all at once as people's incomes get over certain thresholds. And it's at the household level. But that's a really function of the economy generally, how the economy is doing. So people's incomes are rising, they demand more goods, and what the income changes, then we say these are income elastic or normal goods. If it's negative, then we say these are inferior goods. It's just the opposite condition. If buyers' incomes are going down and we demand more of these goods, then we get a positive divided by negative, which ends up at a negative value. Positive divided by negative is a negative value. So it's less than 0, it's negative. So we say that's an inferior good. So we would need to know what kind of a good we're dealing with. Likewise, if incomes are rising and people demand less of that good, people might demand fewer generics or whatever. If incomes are rising, then you've got a negative divided by a positive, and that is once again a negative value. So those are inferior goods. This is how we measure it by this measure. So this is not particularly challenging or complex. We do have this sort of range here that makes it a little bit ambiguous, and it really depends on the magnitude of the difference between 0 and 1. This interval here, this is why we set up as an inequality. This interval, it really depends upon where it is, and they're primarily normal goods because they're positive, so they're not negative, but they're not above 1 either. And we're saying there's a primarily non-luxury goods because they don't really respond greater than proportional to the change in income. They might be approximate to that. So somewhere between 0 and 1, and that's sort of that middle range here. We still say it's income inelastic, but we're primarily talking about that. And it's not a lot of goods really that fall into this category, but they are normal goods and they are mostly non-luxury items. Okay, and it's a very close call between goods that are now normal and goods which are now inferior. Okay. All right. So, any questions about that? Okay. Anybody on the Zoom call have any questions? I'm trying to keep an eye on the little chat room thing there. The chat box, I should say. Okay. Let's move on to the next topic here, and that is, and it's the final topic with regard to the final issue of elasticity, and that is cross-price elasticity. And this is dealing with the other set of ordered pair, a couple pairs that we call substitutes and complements. Remember, we called these dichotomous pairs some time ago. We're talking about goods which are another. And so if you're a complementary good to something other good, it cannot also be a substitute. So here the definition is the sensitivity response of some good we'll call X to change in the price of some other good Y. We'll say it's related. How is it related? Well, we need to know what the ratio is here. that cross price elasticity ratio so that we know, is it a substitute? Is it a complement? And by the way, the strength of this, whether it's positive or negative, it's the strength of how big that number is. It tells us how responsive that thing is. And sometimes we don't really know that goods are substitutes for one another until we do this kind of measure, because it's sometimes hard to, follow people's preferences. And sometimes people have some odd choices, or at least it may seem like to us as outside observers. I mean, if the price of movies goes up, maybe you'll go to some minor league ball games as instead a lot more. Then does that mean movies and minor league ball games are substitutes? I'm not saying they are, but what if there's a very strong relationship that says that they are? Well, then maybe they are. And then I think we have to understand. I think it may be a bit of an absurd example, but sometimes you just never know what goods are substitutes for other goods. Okay, so here we're talking about the cross elasticity of E sub xy, that's good X and good Y, percentage change in quantity of good X divided by the percentage change in the price of good Y. Percentage good change in the price of good Y. And and here, once again, we're not taking the absolute value because we do care if it's positive or negative. With the absolute value expressions or values, it's always going to be positive, but here we want to know if it's a negative, and I'll talk about what that is. And so the formula for this, if you don't have this, again, this is all in the PowerPoint package, is this, and I think I did. No, I didn't. This is the generic formula. It looks pretty nasty, but it's the same thing we've been talking about before. It's the point method where we're starting at some P and some Q. The only difference between this and price elasticity of demand is the fact that we've got a different good. It's a related good, if it is related at all. And by the way, sometimes the relationship is close to zero. And so we say there's no connection between the good at all. I mean, I think we can look at things like matches and lighter fluid maybe being substitutes to some extent, but something like raincoats and Game Boys, I don't know, maybe not. That's probably not. But if we did that, if we ran the numbers, we'd probably say there's really no connection. So those goods are not related in any way. Not as a substitute, not as a complement. They don't replace each other or go with each other. So that's the measure. And so what do we end up with at the end of the day? What's the bottom line here? If the good is positive, or if the ratio is positive, then we say the good is a substitute good. If it turns out the E sub xy is positive, we say it's a substitute. And if it's a very high value, I'm not sick, I'm just struggling with my hands at times. And so if it's a very high value, if it's 6 or 7 or whatever, then we say, okay, well, then it's a very strong substitute. Likewise, if it's a very low negative, like -5, -6, whatever, then we say those goods are very complementary to one another, and they go together, and so they're responsive to changes in the prices of those goods. So let's talk about, and I'll give you a bit of a look here as to how this might play out, and why this means what it is. Because all I've really given you here is a formula. That's maybe, I don't know, maybe that's not particularly useful. So let me give you something a little bit more concrete here. And let's sort of swivel over here, other direction here, and talk about what these differences might look like. Okay. I'll come over here, didn't I? Okay, so if we've got, so let's take the first case where we've got the cross elasticity measure is greater than 0. In other words, it's positive. The value is positive. Well, how do we, first of all, what's the logic behind, it's one thing for us to say, okay, it's positive, so it must be a substitute. Well, how do we know it? How does this work its way out into the logic of this? So remember, the good in question here, it's the price of good X that we're talking about here. So if the price of good X is going up, for instance, right, then what does that mean? Well, it's just simply the law of demand. It says that quantity demand of good X is going to go down, right? If the good obeys the law of demand, and most goods do obey the law of demand, which means what? That if the price of the good goes up, the quantity demand of the good goes down. But then we have the quantity demand of good Y going up. Then we have what? We have a positive divided by positive, which gives us a value that's greater than 0. And so we know that it's a substitute good, particularly if it's logical that happens and that the goods go together, and it sort of makes sense that they go together. And the same goes in the other direction as well. If the price of good X is going down, and the quantity, and this is not functional notation, this is quantity demand of good X goes up, and then it means the quantity demand of good Y then goes down because we are now substituting one good for the other. And so as a result, we have a negative divided by a negative, which gives us a negative divided by a negative is positive. And so that's how we know. And the strength of that, the magnitude of that variable, that tells us how strong those substitutes are. And we know there are some goods that are very close substitutes for one another, either because they simply make sense that they would be, they're fairly close in price anyway. And so buyers are already very sensitive to the price of one good. Things like chicken and pork are very close substitutes for one another. Things like all in the entire realm of canned vegetables. I mean, it goes on and on where these will be calculated. Things like green beans and corn, are very close substitutes. And again, it goes back to the thing that we talked also about some time ago, is that they're not identical goods. Green beans and corn are not the same good at all. We're not even talking about one brand versus another brand. We're talking about one good that is being swapped out for some other good. The brand substitutes are a little bit, that's something different altogether. So these are substitutes, okay? All these goods are substitutes if they meet this criteria based upon these relationships, okay? Cross-price elasticity. All right, what about the case in which we've got a different sort of a relationship going on here, where we've got this kind of deal, where we've got the value where it's now less than 1. In other words, we're saying these are complements. Well, if the price of the good X now goes up, and again, same deal here as before. Okay, quantity demand of good X goes down. Law of demand still applies. But now, because we're demanding less of good X, we're demanding less of good Y as well, because these goods go together. And because they go together, we're also going to have this go down. And so as a result, you have a negative divided by positive, which gives you a negative in this regard. Okay. Negative divided by positive gives you a negative. And the same goes in the other direction, where the price of the good X is going down, the quantity demand of a good X goes up, as does the quantity demand of a good Y. And as a result, you have a positive divided by negative, which gives you a negative. And it's the magnitude of that variable, whether it's a very large negative versus a very small negative, that tells you to what degree these goods are complements, that they go together. And complements tend to be a little bit more logically construed than substitutes, because even though I kind of gave what might have been a rather absurd example of movie prices and minor league baseball tickets, well, maybe there are some goods that do act as substitutes that we aren't really aware of. I don't know that you can say that as much with complements, because these goods are linked together for various reasons. And the examples we've given before are things like hot dogs and hot dog buns, and toothbrushes and toothpaste, shoes and socks. I mean, they go together. You're not going to buy one without buying some of the other. And some of these will go up over time just simply because the demand will go up over time. And if people are buying more of one, they're buying more of the other. And if one good is falling out of favor and people are buying less of it, they'll buy less of the other as well. So those tend to make some sense. Okay. All right. So questions from me about anything with regard to that. So those are the 3 measures of elasticity that I really wanted to focus on, and not so much on this issue of the price elasticity of supply. Not that it's not important, not that we can't do things with it and whatnot, but I think those are the ones that are the most critical for our understanding. And I want to do one more thing before we move into chapter 6. And I know that just given the fact that we got off to a late start here, we're going to not have time to do as much as I had hoped. But I do want to talk about the implications to the supply side, and that with price elasticity demand. So that's the most important, is the one we started with, price elasticity demand. So we started with that because it was the most important. But it's going to be a good lead-in, and I hope everybody really pays attention to this, because it's a sort of good lead-in to a lot of what we're going to be covering throughout the class. And that is, what is the implication of the supply side, and what is the supply side's motivation? So and we're going to talk, again, you're going to get tired of hearing me say this, but we're going to talk about what the motivations of these 3 actor groups are that we see in the circular flow model. What are the motivations of households, the motivations of firms, the motivations even of government, okay? Well, with business firms, we're saying their prime motive is what? If you're a business firm, as we defined it early on, is what? What's the objective of a business firm? To make profit, to maximize profit. And we say that all these actors engage in what we call maximizing behavior. which is not to say that's the 100% fixation, 100% 24/7 of the time, because maybe it is, maybe it isn't. Particularly with households, I think it's difficult to say households are purely maximizing in terms of income and wealth, because we have other things that we do. Otherwise, we'd all have 2 and 3 jobs and whatnot. So the business firms are a little bit easier to understand from that perspective. And so if we're trying to maximize profit, then let's go to this idea of how do we maximize. First of all, what are the definitions we need to know? Well, the price of a good times the quantity of a good equals what we call total revenue. Total revenue, okay? Total revenue, or TR. So we're going to get familiar with that sort of reference as we get going throughout the class. Total revenue. Total revenue are what we could call is inflows to the firm. Inflows to the firm. And I know that sometimes in this class we talk about how the econ world diverges a little bit from the accounting world. This is pretty much the way the accounting world sees what revenues are. You can think of them as sales if you like, right? They're inflows to the firm, usually in the form of money, or at least denominated in money, right? And the accounting world will recognize that as well. These are inflows to the firm, okay? So, and then the way to maximize profit then is to take total revenue minus the total cost. So this is total revenue minus total cost. And then you end up with profit, okay? Which we are going to now know as the pi symbol. Okay, and the pi symbol, which does not mean 3.14159. Don't think of that as the ratio of circumference to diameter. This is it's just simple a Greek symbol for profit. And by the way, what drives people crazy, among other things about economists, is that we use a different pi symbol in macro to mean something else. And so let's not worry about that for right now, since we're in micro. So total revenue minus total cost. So in other words, inflows minus outflows, right? That's really what these are. Inflows minus outflows equals the residual, which is profit, or pi. Okay, so this is an important thing to recognize. This is not really all that challenging to sort of get at, really. I mean, I think we pretty much understand what's happening here. But what is interesting, what is important to know, is what the relationship is between price elasticity and these particular variables. And so let's talk about what these are. And again, I'm going to come back to price elasticity of demand here. I'm going to go ahead and erase this, and I will I'll adjust the camera here in a second to accommodate what I'm doing. But if we're talking about price elasticity of demand, let me see here. Hold on a second here. This camera is not really, I have to keep hitting this button here in order to get it to move. There we go. Okay. Oh, wrong way. There we go. All right. And again, we come back to the variable in question. It's not positive or negative, it's relationship to one. So if we take this very simple formula here, and I'll just sort of recreate it over here, total revenue equals price times quantity. So TR, total revenue, equals the prices of goods times the quantity of goods. Okay. So if in fact we have this, if the price elasticity of demand is greater than 1, in other words, it's price elastic, then if the price of a good goes up, then total revenue tends to come down. And if the price goes down, total revenue tends to go up. This is an important relationship, because think about this. This is why the supply side, remember, the revenue is a supply side concept. You know, we don't talk about revenue from the standpoint of a demand side at all. It's a supply side idea. So if they determine that the other side of the market demand is elastic, price elastic, if they raise the price of the good, it's only going to reduce the total revenue. Why? Because the reaction on quantity demand is going to be greater than proportional to the change in price. So if you try to raise the price on a good that buyers are very sensitive to, and by the way, this I think makes a lot of sense. If we try to raise the price on a good where buyers are really sensitive, the buyers just simply walk away, and the quantity demand falls like a stone. And so as a result, you have something that ends up being, very, very sensitive. And so the total revenue goes down like a rock, right? Because we sell less quantity. Remember what's going on here. There's a push-pull relationship. TR, price goes up, quantity goes down, price goes down, quantity goes up, right? That's an important thing to sort of keep in mind here, is those relationships. But if the price goes down, people rush in to buy the good, the total revenue goes up, because the response to the quantity demand is greater than the change in price. So we earn more revenue. Now, one thing that's missing from this altogether is profit, because we don't have the cost input here. So we realize we're only dealing with the demand side, but it does have implications. Because the strategy of your firm is to manage revenue, and that's very often a very common strategy, then you simply want to know how sensitive the demand side is to the price of the good. And we've seen examples where firms have misunderstood the price elasticity of demand for the good, and it's worked to their detriment. And I think the example we used in class the other day was Netflix, when they tried to change the pricing scheme. And they were probably a little bit late to do that, because by that time there were other streaming services out there. And the demand side reacted pretty violently, and they had to walk it back a little bit. Yeah, but we see examples of this from time to time. We see examples where this kind of thing happened. Twitter, we talked about Twitter, didn't we? Where what did Elon Musk try to do? Something put on like an $8 a month sort of service, and the demand side and it said, no, we're not interested at all. That's an example of very sensitive demand. And finally, here, if we've got, well, not finally, but if it's the other direction, where now we've got elasticity demand is very insensitive. If the price of the good goes up, so will total revenue. If the price of the good goes down, so will total revenue. So here, remember, the change in quantity demand is not that sensitive to the change in price. And so if the price changes a little bit, it doesn't matter, people still buy the good. So why not change the price on goods? And they do. And think about goods which are price inelastic, things like pharmaceutical drugs. This explains why pharmaceutical drugs are expensive. It's because, particularly when they're under patent, people have no choice but to buy them if you want that good. And I think a lot of people don't know that they should maybe ask their doctor for a generic. If a generic exists, if the goods under patent, a generic doesn't exist though. And you know, so I think it's important to know. So why not raise the price of the good if the demand side is inelastic? And sellers would always love to sell to a demand side that's inelastic, that's insensitive, so they can manage the price. In other words, a lot of business activity is about steepening the demand curve. Do all kinds of activities like marketing, making the product seem different and unusual. I had a student once, and I talked about the fact that Harley Davidson might have a substitute like Hondas or whatever. He absolutely was adamant there is no substitute whatsoever for Harley Davidson's. Was absolutely wouldn't hear it. And I would say he's probably pretty much sold on the idea there is no substitute for Harley Davidson. Probably owns one. Probably paid a lot of money for it. Probably couldn't save money if he'd bought a Honda. Doesn't matter. So that's an example of marketing, right? It's getting the demand curve to get steep. I can't buy generic detergent. I've got to buy Tide. So I'll pay more for Tide, right? By the way, I haven't noticed that they lock Tide up at the Walmart on Carla. It's like, it's such a high price good that they're locking the darn thing up. What in the world is going on, right? So you got to get there. I don't know if anybody's seen that, but you have detergent. I mean, I've seen them lock up things like expensive liquor, but not not that. So yeah, now we're locking up detergent. So anyway, so this is the implication of the supply side. So anyway, so it's probably as well we didn't get to chapter 6, so we get off to a fresh start on Wednesday. Again, for those of you who are joining on the video link, we got off to a late start because the AV had to run over to install some software. My apologies. And I know that was going to happen. I would have come earlier this morning and had them do that, but I didn't. It just kind of popped up on the screen. Hey, you need to change software. So, okay. Well, any questions for me about anything we've done today? All right. Well, that does it for elasticity. When we come back on Wednesday, we'll get into the utility piece and we will take it from there. So have a great rest of your day.